A mountain man was still a virgin at 40. He figured he'd live and die alone in the high country, with nothing but the pines for company, until a lonely Amish girl came knocking on his door in the dead of winter, half frozen and begging for shelter. He thought he was saving her from a storm, but he was really inviting a war right to his doorstep. And this war wouldn't be fought with rifles and knives. Not at first. It would be fought with whispers, with lies, and with a darkness that had followed this young woman all the way up the mountain. A darkness that wanted her back, and it was willing to kill anyone who stood in its way. The wind was screaming that night, a real mountain fury that rattled the logs of Jonah McBride's cabin. He sat in his rough-hewn chair, the firelight flickering across his weathered face, a whittling knife moving slow and steady in his big hands. Wood shavings curled away from the piece of pine, falling to the floor like tiny pale commas. He was carving a simple cross, something to pass the long, lonely hours. "Lord," he whispered, his voice gravelly from disuse, "grant me strength for another winter alone." The words felt small in the big silence of the cabin. For 15 years, this was his life. His rifle mounted above the door, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a neat stack of logs by the hearth. A solitary man's world, built for function, not feeling. Just as the cold started to seep through the chinked logs, a sound cut through the storm's howl. Knocking. Frantic, desperate knocking at his door. Jonah froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. No one ever came to his door after dark. No one. Especially not in a blizzard like this. He set the cross down, his hand instinctively going for the rifle. The knocking came again, weaker this time, almost like a final plea. He unbarred the heavy plank door and pulled it open. Snow and wind exploded into the cabin, and there, framed by the swirling white, stood a young woman. She was wearing a black bonnet and a simple cloak, her face as pale as the snow itself. "Please," she breathed, her lips blue with cold. Then her eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed. Jonah lunged, catching her before she hit the frozen ground. She was impossibly light in his arms, her clothes stiff with ice. He kicked the door shut against the storm and carried her to the bearskin rug in front of the fireplace. His hands trembled as he worked, fumbling to remove her frozen cloak and bonnet. Her dress was simple, dark, and unmistakably Amish. Dark hair was coming loose from its pins, framing a face that held a quiet beauty, a beauty that made Jonah's throat tighten with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. "Miss," he said, his voice softer than he intended, "can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. He ran a hand through his graying beard, his mind racing. He had to get her warm, fast. Propriety be damned. He covered her with his thickest wool blanket and moved to the kitchen area to heat some broth. The familiar motions of cooking steadied his shaking hands. The smell of dried meat and herbs slowly filled the small space, a homey scent in the midst of a crisis. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, he heard a soft moan. He turned. The young woman was stirring, her eyes slowly opening. "Where?" she started, then coughed, a weak, rattling sound. "You're safe," Jonah said, keeping his voice low and gentle. "You're in my cabin. I'm Jonah McBride." He moved closer, offering a tin cup of the warm broth. "Can you sit up?" She nodded weakly, and he helped her, keeping the blanket tucked tight around her shoulders. Her hands shook as she took the cup. "I'm Miriam," she said, her voice a soft whisper after a small sip. "Miriam Stoltzfus." Her accent was distinct, Pennsylvania Dutch. "What brings a woman like you out in a storm like this, Miss Stoltzfus?" Jonah asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Her fingers tightened on the cup, her knuckles turning white. I left the settlement 4 days ago." Her voice dropped even lower. "I was trying to reach Denver. There were Teamsters. They said they'd take me." She shuddered, a full-body tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. "But when the snow started, they left me." Jonah's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. He knew the type. Rough men who'd leave a stray dog to die in a storm, let alone a young woman. "These Teamsters," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What were their names?" "Jed Mallory and Clyde Boone," she replied, then added quickly, "But please, don't trouble yourself over them. It was God's will that led me to your door instead." Jonah shifted, uncomfortable. His own faith was a weathered, calloused thing, worn rough by years of solitude. But looking at Miriam's earnest face, her eyes shining in the firelight, he couldn't help but wonder, why here? Why now? You need rest, he said abruptly, standing up. You take my bed. I'll sleep here by the fire. Oh no, I couldn't possibly. I insist, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He was already gathering extra blankets for himself. Exhaustion won out over her protests. He helped her to the small bed in the corner, then retreated to his chair. He listened as her breathing evened out, finally settling into the deep rhythm of sleep. The storm raged on. Snow piled up against the windows. But inside, the cabin felt different. Warmer. Less empty. For 15 years, he'd told himself he was content with his solitude. But now, with this stranger under his roof, he felt that solitude for what it truly was. A deep and aching loneliness. Why now, Lord? He whispered to the crackling flames. After all these years, why send her to me? The fire popped in response, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled a lonely answer, back at the storm. Jonah knew he wouldn't be sleeping tonight. His mind kept replaying the image of her collapsing in the snow, the feel of her light weight in his arms, the trust in her eyes when she took the broth from his hand. He thought of his own past, of the fever that took his parents, of the hard years learning to survive alone. He'd worn his solitude like a heavy coat, a necessary protection against the coldness of the world. But now, listening to Miriam's peaceful breathing, he felt that coat beginning to tear at the seams, and he wasn't sure if he was terrified or grateful. Morning came slowly, pale gray light filtering through the cracks in the wooden shutters. Jonah had dozed in his chair, waking every hour to feed the fire. He moved quietly, starting the breakfast oats, careful not to disturb the sleeping woman who had so completely upended his world. A floorboard creaked. He turned. Miriam was standing by the bed, folding the heavy wool blanket with precise, careful movements. "Good morning," she said softly. "I hope I haven't overslept." "Sun's barely up," Jonah replied, his voice still rough. "There's water in the basin if you'd like to wash up." She nodded gratefully. In the morning light, he could see the shadows under her eyes, a weariness that went deeper than just a few days in a storm. This wasn't just a woman who was lost. This was a woman who was running from something terrible. "I don't often have visitors," he said, focusing on the bubbling oats. "Been up here 15 years, but you're welcome to stay until the weather clears." "You are very kind," Miriam said. She finished washing and then hesitated. "I can earn my keep. I know how to cook and mend." She paused, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I cannot return to my people, but I have not lost my faith, even if they think I have." Jonah just nodded, not pushing. He served the oats into 2 wooden bowls, adding a rare drizzle of honey to each. They ate in a silence that was thick with unspoken questions. After breakfast, he pulled on his heavy coat. "Need to chop more wood," he said, grabbing his axe. "Storm's not done with us." From outside, he could hear her moving about the cabin, tidying up with an efficiency that spoke of a lifetime of practice. The familiar rhythm of the axe helped him think. The sharp thwack as the blade bit into the pine, the clean split of the wood. A responsibility he hadn't asked for had landed on his doorstep. It was a heavy weight, but strangely, not an unwelcome one. When he came back inside, the cabin was filled with the smell of baking bread. Miriam had found his meager stores and was working magic. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the Dutch oven nestled in the coals. "I thought we could use a proper supper." "Mind?" Jonah shook his head, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Reckon that's the best thing to happen to this kitchen in years." They ate the meal of seasoned beans and warm cornbread in a comfortable quiet. He found himself watching her, the way her small hands broke the bread, the quiet strength in her posture. He was 40 years old and had spent more time with bears than with women, and it showed. He felt clumsy, too big, too rough for the gentle space she created around her. As evening fell, Miriam began to hum while she washed the dishes, a simple, sad melody in Pennsylvania Dutch. Jonah recognized the sound of it, if not the words. It was the sound of homesickness, the sound of exile. He'd heard it in the cry of the lone wolf, in the whistle of the wind through the empty pines. Whatever had driven her from her home, the pain of it was still a fresh wound. He busied himself checking the shutters, giving her a moment of privacy for her grief. He wouldn't pry. When she was ready, she would tell him. Until then, he would offer what he had: shelter, warmth, and a silent promise of protection. "You should take the bed again," he said, reaching for his own blankets. "You are too kind," she protested, but the relief in her eyes was plain to see. "Ain't kindness," he said gruffly, "just common decency." As he settled into his chair for another night's vigil, Jonah looked around the cabin. It was the same space, the same rough logs and stone fireplace. But with Miriam there, it felt different. It felt like a home. The fire burned low, and outside the wind sang its lonely song. But for the first time in a long, long time, Jonah McBride didn't feel lonely at all. He felt something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The storm came back that night with a vengeance, sleet hammering the cabin like 1,000 tiny fists. Jonah was drifting in and out of sleep by the fire when a voice cut through the darkness. It was Miriam praying. Her first words were in her own dialect, a soft, heartbroken murmur. But then she switched to English, and every word was a dagger in the quiet cabin. "Forgive me, Lord," she whispered, her voice catching on a sob. "I know I have disappointed them. They chose Brother Yoder for me, said it was your will." Jonah kept his breathing even, pretending to be asleep, but his heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "How could it be your will?" she cried softly. "For me to marry a man 3 times my age? A man who looks at me and sees only a replacement for the wife he just buried?" So that was it. An arranged marriage she couldn't stomach. He'd wondered, now he knew, and the knowledge made his blood run cold. "Have I broken faith by running?" Her prayer continued, raw and desperate. "Brother Yoder is a good man, they say, a pillar of the community. But I cannot." Her words dissolved into quiet, gut-wrenching sobs. Jonah's hands clenched into fists on the armrests of his chair. He fought every instinct that screamed at him to go to her, to offer comfort. But this was her moment with her God. He had no right to intrude, even as each tear felt like a lash against his own soul. He understood exile. He'd chosen it, but hers had been forced upon her by men claiming to speak for God. When dawn finally broke, his back ached from the hard chair. He moved to the fireplace, the rich aroma of coffee soon filling the air. Miriam emerged from the blankets, her eyes red and swollen. He handed her a cup without a word, a silent offering of understanding. She took it with a murmured, "Thank you." After a simple breakfast of dried apples, Jonah pulled on his heavy coat and then grabbed a second one. "Thought you might like to see how I check my snares," he offered, "if you can brave the cold." Her eyes widened slightly. "I would like that very much." The world outside was a wonderland of ice. Every branch, every twig, was coated in a crystal shell that glittered in the morning sun. "Watch your step," he cautioned, offering her his arm as they navigated a slick patch of ground. Her small gloved hand rested on his forearm, and the simple touch sent a jolt through him. "It's so vast," she breathed, looking out at the endless expanse of mountains. "In my settlement, everything was ordered. Fences and fields. I never imagined such wildness." "There's an order to it," he said, his voice quiet. "You just have to learn how to read it." He showed her his snares, how to read the rabbit tracks in the snow, how to think like the creature you were hunting. She listened intently, her mind sharp and curious. "We were taught to be useful," she explained as they walked, "but useful meant cooking and sewing. The outdoors was men's work." She smiled, a sad, wry little smile. "I'm afraid I'm quite unprepared for this kind of life." "You're doing fine," Jonah assured her. "And those skills you have? They're more important out here than you think. There's no neighbors to turn to when a shirt tears or the food runs low." They returned to the cabin with 2 rabbits, their cheeks pink from the cold. As Miriam prepared the rabbits for a stew, Jonah watched her. She moved with a quiet grace that seemed to calm the very air around her. Later that evening, she noticed a tear in his favorite wool shirt. "That needs mending," she said. "I have thread in my bundle, if you'll permit me." "Much obliged," he replied, watching as her nimble fingers made the tear disappear with a series of tiny, perfect stitches. As she tied off the last stitch and reached to hand it back to him, their hands brushed. It was like a lightning strike. They both pulled back as if burned. A deep blush spread across Miriam's cheeks, and Jonah retreated to his chair, his heart hammering. That brief, accidental touch had awakened something in him he'd thought was buried for good, a powerful, aching longing. He wanted to reach for her again, to feel the softness of her skin against his calloused palm. But the memory of her prayer stopped him cold. She had run from one man's unwanted attention. He would not, could not be another. He picked up his whittling knife, forcing his hands to be steady, letting the familiar work calm the storm inside him. But he was aware of her every breath, every small movement. He was torn between a desperate need for connection and a fierce determination not to betray the trust she'd placed in him. The evening passed in a haze of unspoken tension. When Miriam finally went to bed, Jonah stayed up, staring into the dying embers of the fire. Sleep wouldn't come. His mind was a battlefield, filled with images of her soft hands and her sad prayers, and his heart ached with a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical wound. He'd thought he was used to it. He'd been wrong. A few days later, the sky cleared, and the sun shone with a weak winter warmth. Jonah knew he had to make a trip to the creek. The water barrels were nearly empty. "I'll be back in a couple of hours at most," he told Miriam as he prepared his mule. "Button." "Be careful," she said, and he saw a flicker of real fear in her eyes. The same fear he felt at the thought of leaving her alone. "I will," he promised. From inside the cabin, Miriam watched him right away. The moment his figure disappeared down the snowy trail, the cabin felt vast and terrifyingly empty. She shook off the feeling, turning back to the stew she was simmering on the hearth. She began to hum an old hymn, filling the silence with a prayer for protection. That's when she heard it, the sound of approaching horses, not one but several, and the sound of rough male voices laughing. Her blood ran cold. Before she could even think to bar the door, heavy boots stomped onto the porch, and a hard fist hammered against the wood. "Hello, the house!" a voice called out, a voice she recognized with a gut-twisting lurch of terror. "We know someone's in there. Smoke's coming from the chimney." It was Jed Mallory, one of the teamsters who had left her for dead in the storm. Miriam's hands trembled. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her ears. "Open up!" another voice shouted. "We're just looking to warm up a bit." She knew that was a lie. These weren't men looking for warmth. They were predators who had smelled weakness. And she was alone, completely and utterly alone. The door creaked as a heavy shoulder slammed against it from the outside. The iron bar groaned in protest. "The Lord is my shepherd," she whispered, her back pressed against the far wall. "I shall not want." But in that moment, she did want. She wanted the heavy thud of Jonah's boots on the porch. She wanted the safety of his presence. The bar was starting to splinter, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Jonah wasn't going to make it back in time. The heavy plank door shuddered under another blow. Miriam could hear Jed Mallory laughing on the other side, an ugly, grating sound that scraped at her nerves. The iron bar holding the door was groaning, the wood around its bracket splintering. "Come on now, little bird," Mallory's voice oozed through the cracks. "Don't be shy. We just want to say hello." Miriam's mind raced. The rifle was above the door, where Jonah always kept it. Too high for her to reach, and even if she could, she didn't know the first thing about using it. Her eyes darted around the small cabin, searching for a weapon, for any advantage. The fire poker. It was heavy iron, better than nothing. She grabbed it, its weight cold and unfamiliar in her trembling hands. The door crashed open. Mallory stood there grinning, flanked by Clyde Boone and a third man she didn't recognize. Their eyes drank in the sight of her, alone and terrified. "Well, look what we have here," Mallory sneered, stepping inside. "The little Amish runaway, all cozy in the hermit's nest." "You need to leave," Miriam said, her voice shaking but firm. "This is Mr. McBride's home. He will be back any moment." Boone laughed. "Oh, we're counting on it. Figured we'd wait for him inside. Get ourselves a taste of whatever smells so good." He took a step toward the stew pot, but his eyes never left her. "What do you want?" Miriam demanded, tightening her grip on the poker. What do we want? Mallory's grin widened, showing yellow teeth. Well, first, we want an apology. Leaving us high and dry like that back in the storm wasn't very Christian of you. It was such a blatant lie it stole her breath. And second, he let his gaze wander around the cabin. We hear there's a reward out for a girl just like you. $100. A man could have a real good time with $100. So that was it. The bounty. Word had reached them. But here's the thing, Mallory continued, taking another step closer. The poster says return her to her family. It don't say in what condition. Ice flooded Miriam's veins. The third man chuckled, a low, menacing sound. They were closing in, cutting off any chance of escape. She held the poker out in front of her. Stay back, she warned. Mallory just laughed. Or what? You gonna poke us with that? He lunged. Miriam swung the heavy iron poker with all her might. She wasn't aiming, just reacting. A wild arc of desperation. The end of it connected with Mallory's shoulder with a sickening thud. He howled in pain and surprise, stumbling backward. It was the opening she needed. She didn't hesitate. She dropped the poker and bolted past them, out the open door and into the freezing air. She didn't have a cloak, no shoes fit for the deep snow. But she ran. Adrenaline surged through her, numbing her bare feet to the biting cold. Get her! She heard Mallory scream behind her. She scrambled down the path toward the creek, slipping and sliding in the snow. She could hear their heavy boots pounding behind her, their curses cutting through the clean mountain air. The forest. If she could just make it to the trees, she might be able to lose them. A hand grabbed the back of her dress, yanking her backward. She fell hard into the snow, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Clyde Boone loomed over her, his face a mask of cruel satisfaction. Not so fast, little bird, he snarled, dragging her to her feet. He twisted her arm behind her back, marching her back toward the cabin. Mallory was waiting on the porch, nursing his shoulder, his face livid with rage. You're gonna regret that, he hissed as Boone shoved her inside. You're gonna regret that very much. They threw her into a chair, and this time, there was no escape. The third man produced a coil of rope from his saddlebag. As he started toward her, Miriam closed her eyes and prayed, not for rescue, but for strength. And then a new sound cut through the tense silence, the sound of a single mule moving steadily up the path. Mallory's head snapped toward the door. He's back, he spat. Clyde, get the door. We'll give the hermit a warm welcome. Boone moved to stand behind the door, pulling his pistol. Mallory positioned himself on the other side, his own gun drawn. The third man stood over Miriam, a knife pressed against her throat. One sound out of you, he whispered, and it'll be your last. Miriam's heart felt like it was going to explode. This was a trap. Jonah was walking right into a trap, and it was all her fault. The footsteps stopped just outside, a moment of unbearable silence. Miriam, Jonah's voice called out, laced with concern. Then the door swung open. Jonah stepped inside, his arms full of water barrels, his face etched with worry. For a split second he saw the scene. Miriam held captive, the armed men waiting in ambush. His eyes widened in shock. It was the only opening they needed. Boone slammed the door shut and brought the butt of his pistol down hard on the back of Jonah's head. Jonah crumpled to the floor without a sound, the water barrels crashing around him, sending icy water sloshing across the wooden planks. Jonah! Miriam screamed, the sound torn from her throat. The man holding her clamped a hand over her mouth. Shouldn't have done that, he hissed. Mallory nudged Jonah's unconscious form with the toe of his boot. Well, he said with a cold smile, that was easier than I thought. He looked at Miriam, his eyes glittering with malice. Now where were we? Jonah came to with a groan, the back of his head throbbing with a dull, blinding pain. The cabin was dark. The fire burned down to nothing but a few glowing embers. He was slumped against the wall, his hands tied tightly behind his back. He was alone. Miriam, he croaked, his voice raw. The only answer was the mournful sigh of the wind outside. He struggled against his bonds, but the ropes were tight, cutting into his wrists. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in his throat. He pushed it down. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. He had to think. His eyes scanned the cabin. It was a wreck. A chair was overturned. The stew pot was on its side, its contents spilled across the floor. And on the table, a piece of paper was held down by a knife stabbed deep into the wood. With a grunt of effort, he managed to get to his feet, his head swimming. He staggered to the table and leaned over, craning his neck to read the crude scrawl on the paper. We have the girl. The reward is ours. Stay away if you value your life. Yoder will have what belongs to him. Yoder. Brother Yoder. The name from Miriam's prayer. This wasn't just a random act by greedy teamsters. This was planned. They were taking her back. Back to the man she had fled. The man who saw her as property. A new kind of fury, cold and clear and terrifyingly calm, settled over Jonah. It burned away the pain in his head, sharpened his senses. They had made a mistake. They thought he was just a simple hermit. They didn't know who he used to be. They didn't know what he was capable of. He looked down at his bound hands. Years of trapping and surviving in the wild had taught him a thing or two. He began to work his wrists, subtly, patiently, testing the knots, feeling for any slack. It was slow, agonizing work. Every minute that passed was a minute they were getting further away. Finally, he felt a slight give. He pulled harder, ignoring the raw, burning pain as the rope scraped his skin. With a final, desperate jerk, his right hand slipped free. He quickly untied the other, his fingers clumsy but fast. He was free. He didn't waste a second. He grabbed his rifle, checking the load. He shoved extra ammunition into his pockets. He strapped his hunting knife to his belt. He grabbed a strip of jerky, stuffing it in his mouth and chewing as he moved. He paused only long enough to see a small dark object on the floor near the hearth. Miriam's bonnet. It must have fallen off in the struggle. He picked it up, his rough fingers tracing the simple, neat stitches. He carefully folded the worn fabric and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, a silent promise pressed against his heart. He stepped out into the biting cold of the night. The moon was a sliver of ice in a black sky. He found their tracks easily in the snow. 2 horses heavily laden. They had a head start, maybe a few hours. But they were moving slow, burdened by their captive. And they didn't know these mountains. Not like he did. He saddled Button, the old mule sensing the urgency, standing stock still as Jonah worked. He mounted up, his body screaming in protest, his head still throbbing, but he ignored it. There was only one thing that mattered now. I'm coming, he whispered into the wind, the words of prayer and a threat. Hold on, Miriam, I'm coming. He urged the mule forward into the darkness, following the trail that would lead him either to Miriam's rescue or to his own grave. He knew the bounty hunters thought they had won. They had the girl. The reward was as good as theirs. What they didn't know was that they hadn't just kidnapped an Amish girl. They had unleashed a ghost, a man who had come to the mountains to bury his past. And now, to save his future, he was going to have to dig it all back up again. The trail was easy to follow, even in the faint moonlight. Too easy. Jonah reined in his mule at the edge of a ravine, his senses on high alert. These men, Mallory and Boone, they were sloppy. But they weren't stupid. They had to know he'd come after them. Leaving a trail this clear felt less like carelessness and more like an invitation, a trap. Instead of following the tracks down into the narrow ravine, he dismounted and led Button up the ridge, moving silently through the dense pines that clung to the mountainside. The wind was colder up here, cutting through his coat, but it gave him the high ground. From here he could look down, see without being seen. He moved with a patience honed by years of hunting prey far more cunning than men. He found them an hour before dawn, camped in a small sheltered clearing at the far end of the ravine, just as he'd suspected. They'd built a large, smoky fire, a beacon in the darkness. They wanted him to find them. They were waiting for him. Miriam was tied to a tree, her back to the fire. Even from a distance, he could see the slump of her shoulders, the exhaustion in her posture. Mallory and Boone were taking turns on watch, passing a bottle back and forth. Their third man was nowhere in sight. An ambush. Classic. Jonah's jaw tightened. They were treating this like a game. He would show them how quickly the game could end. He left Button tethered in a thicket and began to circle the camp, a shadow moving among shadows. He wasn't the man he was 15 years ago. Age had stiffened his joints, slowed him down. But the mountains had given him something in return, an instinct for survival that was as sharp as his knife. He found the third man easily, crouched behind a cluster of boulders above the camp, a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He was perfectly positioned to shoot anyone who walked into the clearing. Jonah came up behind him without a sound. The man never even knew he was there. One moment he was watching the camp. The next Jonah's arm was around his throat, cutting off his air. The man struggled, but it was useless. Jonah was a force of nature, silent and final. The man went limp. Jonah lowered him to the ground, taking his rifle and tying him securely with his own rope. One down, two to go. He moved back to his vantage point above the camp. The sky was beginning to pale in the east. He had to act before full light. He picked up a rock, the size of his fist, and took aim. Not at the men, but at the steep, snow-covered slope on the other side of the camp. He threw the rock with all his strength. It landed high on the slope, dislodging a cascade of snow and smaller rocks. The sound was like a gunshot in the pre-dawn quiet. "What was that?" Mallory yelled, jumping to his feet, pistol drawn. "Over there!" Boone shouted, pointing toward the noise. Both men turned their backs on the ravine entrance, their attention completely focused on the false alarm. It was the only opening Jonah needed. He moved down the slope into the camp, as silent as the falling snow. He was 10 feet from them before they sensed his presence. Boone spun around, his eyes wide with shock. He tried to raise his pistol, but Jonah was too fast. He lunged forward, not with his rifle, but with his body, slamming into Boone and sending them both crashing to the ground. Mallory fired his pistol wildly, the shot going wide and echoing through the ravine. Before he could fire again, Miriam, with a burst of desperate strength, kicked out, her bare foot catching the back of his knee. He stumbled, giving Jonah the second he needed. Jonah rolled free from the groaning Boone and launched himself at Mallory. This wasn't a fight. It was a storm. All the pent-up rage, all the fear for Miriam's safety, exploded out of him. He moved with a brutal efficiency that spoke of a past life, a life filled with violence. Fists flew, connecting with bone-jarring force. It was over in less than a minute. Mallory and Boone lay groaning in the snow, disarmed and defeated. Jonah stood over them, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloody. He turned to Miriam, his eyes softening as he saw her. She was staring at him, not with fear, but with awe. He quickly cut her ropes, his hands gentle as he helped her to her feet. "Jonah," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "How did you—" "It doesn't matter," he said gruffly, pulling his spare blanket from his saddlebag and wrapping it around her trembling shoulders. "All that matters is you're safe." He rounded up the 3 men, tying them together. "The reward isn't worth your lives," he said, his voice cold as the iron of his rifle barrel. "You're going to walk out of these mountains. You're going to tell Brother Yoder that Miriam Stoltzfus is under my protection, and if he ever sends anyone else, they won't be walking out." He watched them go, 3 defeated figures stumbling through the snow. Only when they were out of sight did he allow himself to truly look at Miriam. "You're hurt," he said, his gaze falling on the raw, red rope burns on her wrists. "I'm all right," she said, but her voice trembled. "Jonah, those things you did, the way you fought, you're not just a trapper, are you?" He looked away toward the rising sun that was painting the snowy peaks in hues of pink and gold. A long silence stretched between them. "No," he said finally, his voice quiet and heavy with the weight of the past. "I'm not." He turned back to her, his eyes holding a deep, ancient sadness. "There are things you don't know about me, Miriam. Things I came to these mountains to forget." Miriam stepped closer, her hand finding his. Her touch was warm, steady. "The past doesn't matter, Jonah. All that matters is who you are now. And the man I see is the man who came for me." But Jonah knew it wasn't that simple. His past had a long shadow, and by saving Miriam, he may have just cast that shadow over both of them. Because Brother Yoder wasn't a man who would give up easily, and now he not only wanted Miriam back, he wanted revenge. The journey back to the cabin was slow, a silent trek through a world made clean and white by the fresh snow. Jonah led the mule, Miriam wrapped in a blanket on its back, her small hands clutching the saddle horn. The fight had left him drained, his body aching, but a deeper exhaustion weighed on his soul. The violence had felt too familiar, too easy. A part of him he'd thought was long dead had woken up, and it scared him. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. It stood as they had left it, a cold, dark shell. Jonah helped Miriam down, his hands lingering at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. Inside, he worked quickly, building a fire until warmth and light began to push back the cold and the dark memories. He knelt before her, gently tending to the rope burns on her wrists with a salve of witch hazel and herbs. His touch was so tender, it brought tears to her eyes. "You're hurt too," she whispered, reaching out to dab at a cut on his cheek with a damp cloth. "It's nothing," he murmured, but he didn't pull away from her touch. In the flickering firelight, the small cabin felt like the only safe place in the world. "Jonah," she said, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "There's something I have to tell you. The real reason I ran." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "The marriage to Yoder." "I know." She shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "It's more than that. It's not just that I wouldn't marry him. It's that I couldn't." She took a shaky breath. "Brother Yoder's last wife, Sarah. She was my friend. She didn't die of a fever like everyone believes." Jonah's hand stilled. He waited. "She was afraid of him," Miriam whispered, her eyes wide and haunted. "He has a darkness in him, Jonah, a cruelty that he hides behind Scripture. The week before she died, Sarah gave me something, for safekeeping. She made me promise not to look at it unless something happened to her." She reached into a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her simple dress and pulled out a small folded piece of oilcloth. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped it. Inside was a letter, written in a shaky, spidery hand. "It's from Sarah," Miriam said, her voice breaking. "She wrote it the night she died. She says Yoder was poisoning her, slowly, that he was angry because she couldn't give him a son." Jonah took the letter. The words were a testament to a hidden horror, a quiet evil lurking in the heart of a pious community. This changed everything. This wasn't about a runaway bride anymore. This was about murder. "This is why he wants you back so badly," Jonah said, his voice grim. "This letter is proof. It would destroy him." "It's not just him," Miriam said, shaking her head. "He has followers, men who believe he speaks for God. They protect him. The town preacher, Elias Vaughn. I saw him visiting Yoder's settlement. They're connected somehow." The preacher, the man who had warned Jonah about the scandal of housing Miriam. It hadn't been about Christian charity. It had been a threat. He was in Yoder's pocket. They had eyes and ears everywhere. A sudden, sharp crack from outside made them both jump. It wasn't the sound of a falling branch. It was the sound of a rifle shot. Jonah was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his own rifle and moving to the window, pulling Miriam down behind him. He peered through a small gap in the shutters. "What is it?" Miriam whispered, her body pressed close to his. In the distance, illuminated by the cold moonlight on the snow, he could see them. A group of a dozen men on horseback, moving steadily up the mountain path toward the cabin. They were dark figures, grim and silent. At their head rode a large, imposing man with a long, dark beard. Even from here, Jonah could feel the cold, righteous fury radiating from him. "It's Yoder," Jonah said, his voice a low growl. "He didn't send his dogs this time. He came himself." They weren't coming to talk. They weren't coming to negotiate. They were a posse, a hunting party. They were coming to deliver what they saw as God's judgment, and they had surrounded the cabin. "Jonah, what are we going to do?" Miriam cried, her hands clutching his arm. Jonah looked around the small cabin, his fortress, his sanctuary. For 15 years it had kept the world out. Tonight it would have to keep an army at bay. He looked down at Miriam, at the terror and trust warring in her eyes. He thought of the quiet peace she had brought into his life, the way her presence had made this lonely shelter feel like a home. He would not let them take her. He would not let them extinguish her light. "They want a war," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the storm of her fear. "We'll give them one." He checked the load on his rifle, his movements fluid and sure. The hermit was gone. The trapper was gone. The man he used to be, the man he had tried to bury, was back, and he was standing between the woman he loved and the darkness that had come to claim her. The firelight glinted off the long barrel of his rifle. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, a drumbeat of approaching doom. But inside, Jonah McBride was no longer afraid. He was ready. "Stay away from the windows," Jonah commanded, his voice a low, urgent whisper. He shoved the heavy wooden table against the door, reinforcing it. He checked the shutters, making sure they were barred tight. The cabin was plunged into near darkness, with only the faint flickering glow of the fire for light. Outside, the hoofbeats stopped. An eerie silence descended, broken only by the sound of the wind and Miriam's ragged breathing. "Jonah McBride!" A voice boomed, deep and resonant with authority. It was a voice used to being obeyed. Yoder. "You are harboring a sinner, a thief who has stolen from my house and fled the judgment of God. Send out the woman, Miriam Stoltzfus, and you will be spared." Jonah moved to a small chink in the logs, peering out. Yoder sat on a large black horse, a Bible held aloft in one hand. Behind him, his men were dismounting, rifles at the ready. Among them, Jonah saw the stern, unforgiving face of the preacher, Elias Vaughn. "She is under my protection, Yoder," Jonah shouted back, his voice echoing in the night. "She is guilty of nothing." "You dare to question the will of the community?" Yoder thundered. "You, a hermit living in sin, dare to speak of guilt and innocence? She has until sunrise to come out. If she does not, we will burn this den of iniquity to the ground, with both of you inside." Miriam let out a small sob. "Jonah, maybe I should go," she whispered, her face pale in the firelight. "I can't let you die for me." Jonah turned, crossing the cabin in 2 strides. He took her face in his hands, his rough palms gentle against her skin. "Listen to me, Miriam," he said, his voice fierce. "For 15 years I lived a half-life up here. I was breathing, but I wasn't alive. Not really. You changed that. You brought me back. I'm not dying for you. I'm living for you. Do you understand?" Tears streamed down her face, but she nodded. "Good," he said. "Now I need your help. Is there another way out of here? A root cellar? Anything?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "Just the door and the windows." Jonah's mind raced. A siege. They were trapped. But he knew these mountains. He knew things others didn't. "The hearth," he said suddenly. "The chimney flue. Is it wide enough for a person?" I think so," she stammered. "It's wide at the base." "All right," he said, his plan forming. "Here's what we're going to do." He worked quickly, explaining his desperate idea. He tied a rope around her waist. He would boost her up into the chimney, and she would have to climb. It would be dark, filled with soot, and dangerous. But it was their only chance. "Once you're on the roof," he instructed, "you slide down the backside into the deep snowdrift. Then you run. Don't look back. Head for the Hendersons' place on the next ridge. Tell them what's happened. Go now." "No," she cried, clinging to him. "I won't leave you." "You must," he insisted, his voice gentle but firm. "I can hold them off, but I need to know you're safe. Please, Miriam, trust me." He looked into her eyes, pouring all of his love, all of his conviction into that single gaze. Finally, she nodded, her body trembling. He helped her into the wide stone hearth. "God be with you, Jonah," she whispered, her hand lingering on his cheek for a moment. "And with you," he replied. He boosted her up into the darkness of the chimney. He heard her scrambling, soot raining down. For a terrifying moment, there was silence. Then he heard a faint scrape of boots on the roof, shingles above. She was out. Now it was his turn. He couldn't follow her. He had to give her time. He had to make them believe they were both still inside. He moved around the cabin, kicking over a stool, shouting as if in argument with her. "You're not going out there, Miriam. It's too dangerous." Then he fired his rifle through the shuttered window. The shot splintered the wood, the sound cracking through the night. Outside, Yoder's men shouted in alarm. Jonah reloaded, his heart pounding. He was one man against a dozen. The odds were impossible, but he wasn't fighting for odds. He was fighting for her. He moved from window to window, firing sporadically, making it seem like a desperate, panicked defense. He needed to keep their attention focused on the cabin. on him, giving Miriam precious minutes to get away. A volley of rifle fire answered him, bullets thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin. Splinters flew. The siege had begun. Jonah hunkered down behind the overturned table, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder. He was buying time. Every shot he fired, every minute he kept them pinned down, was another minute for Miriam. Then he heard a new sound, a crackling sound, and he smelled it. Smoke. He peered through his peephole. One of Yoder's men had crept up to the cabin under the cover of the other's fire. He had a torch. The dry logs of the cabin wall were beginning to catch, flames licking up toward the roof. They were going to burn him out. His time was running out. He had to make his move. He took Miriam's bonnet from his pocket, pressing the soft fabric to his lips for a moment. He then grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth and moved to the back wall of the cabin, the one farthest from the fire. He began to pry at the chinking between two of the logs, working with a desperate strength. Years ago, he had loosened these logs to create a small escape hatch, a last resort in case of a fire or a cave-in. He'd never imagined he would use it like this. The mud and moss gave way. He managed to work one of the logs free, creating a small opening just big enough to squeeze through. Smoke was filling the cabin now, stinging his eyes, choking his lungs. The roar of the fire was growing louder. He pushed his rifle through the opening first, then wriggled out into the cold night air. He was behind the cabin, hidden by the deep shadows. The fire was on the other side, casting a hellish orange glow against the snow. Yoder and his men were all gathered there, watching the cabin burn, waiting for him to run out the front door. They were so focused on the fire, they never saw him slip away into the trees. He moved silently through the forest, circling around them. He could see Miriam's tracks heading up the ridge, just as he'd told her. She was safe. Now it was time for justice. He came up behind the preacher, Elias Vaughn, who was standing slightly apart from the others, his face illuminated by the flames, a look of grim satisfaction on his features. "It is God's will," Vaughn murmured to himself. "Is it?" Jonah's voice was a low growl right behind him. Vaughn spun around, his eyes wide with terror. Before he could shout a warning, Jonah's fist connected with his jaw, and the preacher crumpled to the snow. One by one, Jonah moved through the distracted men, a vengeful spirit of the mountain. He used the butt of his rifle, his fists the element of surprise. They were fanatics, not fighters. They were no match for his focused rage. He took down 3 more before the others realized what was happening. Chaos erupted. Yoder roared in fury, trying to rally his men, but it was too late. From the ridge above, a new sound echoed through the night. Shouting, and more gunfire. Tom Henderson and the other Ridge families had arrived. Miriam had made it. They came charging down the slope, their hunting rifles blazing. They might have been suspicious of Jonah before, but they were mountain folk. They protected their own, and tonight, Jonah and Miriam were their own. Yoder saw his cause was lost. He turned to flee, but Jonah was there, blocking his path. The 2 men stood facing each other, the burning cabin casting flickering shadows around them. "This is between you and me," Jonah said, tossing his rifle aside. He didn't need it. The fight was brutal and short. Yoder was a big man, strong from a life of farm work. But Jonah was fueled by a righteous fury that Yoder, in his false piety, could never understand. Jonah's fists were hammers of judgment, and he brought them down on the man who had terrorized Miriam, the man who had murdered his own wife, the man who had brought this darkness to his mountain. He left Yoder broken and bleeding in the snow for the Hendersons to deal with. He found Miriam near the tree line, her face streaked with soot and tears. She ran into his arms and he held her tight, burying his face in her hair, breathing in her scent. The cabin, his home for 15 years, was a raging inferno behind them. He had lost everything he owned. But as he held her, he knew he had never been richer. He had lost his house, but he had found his home. The spring sun melted the last of the snow, and the mountains came alive with the sound of rushing water and the scent of new pine. On a small, sun-drenched patch of land not far from the charred ruins of the old cabin, a new one was taking shape. The neighbors from the ridge, the Hendersons, the Tuckers, the Wilsons, all came to help. Their axes rang out in a steady rhythm, a song of community, of new beginnings. Brother Yoder and the preacher Vaughn were gone, taken down the mountain to face a justice of man, having already faced the justice of the mountain. The letter, Sarah's last words, had been all the proof the law needed. Jonah, his hands sure and steady, laid the final log of his new home into place. Miriam stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. They had been married a week earlier by a new circuit preacher, a kind man with gentle eyes, the entire Ridge community there to witness it. Their new cabin was smaller than the old one, but the windows were bigger, letting in more light, and it was filled not with the silence of solitude, but with the quiet hum of shared lives, with the sound of hymns and the promise of laughter. Jonah looked at Miriam, her face glowing in the afternoon sun, and he knew his lonely winters were over. The storm had brought her to his door, a lost soul seeking shelter. But in saving her, he had found his own salvation. He was no longer a hermit, no longer a ghost hiding from his past. He was a husband. He was home. Thank you for listening to this story. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in facing down a dozen enemies, but in opening your door to a single stranger. It shows that even in the coldest, most isolated places, love can take root and build a home. If you enjoyed this journey and want to hear more tales of courage, justice, and the strange ways of the world, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I've got a lot more stories to tell, and I wouldn't want you to miss what's coming next.